Welcome to The Forest Garden, a podcast for gardeners who want to upgrade their landscapes into biodiverse food forest systems. On today's episode of The Forest Garden, we'll be interviewing Buzz Ferver of Perfect Circle Farm. If you're a regular listener of this podcast, you'll have heard Buzz's name before. He seems to be everywhere all at once during squirrel season, visiting genetic repositories of rare fruit and nut trees across North America. And through his efforts, we, the plant nerds of North America, have access to this incredible diversity of rare tree crop varieties through his mail-order nursery at Perfect Circle Farm. So tune in today to learn about Buzz's work, the history of tree crop selection in North America, and much more. Buzz Ferver, thanks for joining us. Why don't we start off with how you got interested in tree crops and regenerative practices in the first place? We'd like to hear a little bit about your background and what led you to the work that you're doing today.
I kind of, came out of the box as it was, really deeply interested in nature. I remember some of my earliest memories, like 3-4 years old, or like doing crazy things like picking up crab apples and sorting stones in the little funny brook and trying to make, as I aged anyway, trying to make colonies of bees from the bees that were on our privet hedge in the backyard, and just always being really interested in nature and natural systems and what I, later became to understand as ecology. So I've always had that interest. My father was a landscape architect and horticulturist, and so we had a garden center and nursery when I was growing up. So I remember being 7 or 8 years old, my father leaving me out in the cash register on Christmas Eve, selling Christmas trees, to any of the last stragglers that would come in. So he always taught me plants even from that time. I was always interested in what they were, how they grew, what made them interesting for him, because he was an ornamental horticulturist, and I was already much more interested in the woods. I guess around 10 years old, I was lucky enough to drop into the local nature center, Delaware Nature Education Center, it was called at the time. Now it's Delaware Nature Society. And the youth programs director there was my earliest real mentor in native ecology, natural systems. His name's Mike Riska. I think Mike is going to be 80 or 75. I think he's going to be 80. So we're still friends. It's a long time. That's like 55 years of hanging out with that guy. So he taught me an awful lot and took me to all the craziest places. So I grew up in Delaware and southeastern Pennsylvania. So and that's a really interesting place horticulturally, because it's the northernmost range of a lot of southern species and the southernmost range of a lot of northern species. You have the coastal plain and the Piedmont right there, butting up against each other. So Mike took us everywhere within a couple hours of Wilmington, and showed me all the various ecosystems that we had access to: the pine barrens, cedar swamps in Delaware, coastal plain, salt marshes, and of course the forests in Wilmington, Delaware, Chester County along the Brandywine River were phenomenal. And I got to see so many of the pieces that they weren't old growth per se, but they were pretty darn old and had been preserved by some of the families there that had been there historically for a long time, including the DuPonts, who were very careful with their forests. They had an understanding that they were important to them. So, we'd be wandering around these 3 and 4 foot diameter oaks, beech, yellow poplar, in these fantastic rolling hill forests. And of course, the other thing that they had done is had not run a lot of pigs or animals through the understory. So I got a great introduction to the, what a forest would look like if it had never been seriously impacted by white people farming, which was kind of very cool to see all the ground cover, ephemerals, and shrub layer, shade tree layer, and then the canopies of these forests. At 18, I was included as a researcher for the critical natural areas of Delaware. And we, I don't know, probably 150 sites. We toured with a team of people that were, IDing all the plants, making an inventory, and talking about why they're important to the state of Delaware. And so, that was the whole gamut of coastal plain, salt marsh, really, and then the forests in the Piedmont. That kind of formed me and projected me in a certain way. And the whole time I stayed interested in ornamental horticulture too. Getting to know more about plants, learning plant propagation. I learned to graft when I was about 18. A couple people started teaching me. I had some good grafting mentors. And same thing, propagating by cuttings. I learned that along the way too, and that, just out of high school. I did go to work for my father in horticulture at his nursery and garden center for about 5 or 6 years full time. I always worked for him in summer and holidays off and stuff, but then worked for him full time and got even a little further immersed. And, I was an early adopter of the native plant landscaping. And that was happening at the time when I was in my early 20s, probably. It was a big movement away from all the imported Asian and European plants that we were planting in landscapes, which are still getting planted today. We're not going to list them all off, but you know what they are. We all know what they are, right? So I've always been interested in getting the other plants, the native plants that were here, to what are the analogs for them in the landscape. And, along the way, I got interested in building contracting, which kind of threw me off the horticulture track for quite a while, as far as pursuing it in depth. I always fooled around with it, but I kind of made my living, a couple different things, but building contracting primarily, compost work, and some other things. I was a design engineer for a manufacturing company. And then moved to Vermont. Actually, I went to high school in Vermont, which was the most fun thing ever, boarding school. And got to take a look at an entirely different kind of forest, landscape that had been ravaged by the glaciers. And, people think, the glaciers were long ago. But if you have, intimate knowledge of the Piedmont that's never been touched by glaciers, then you come up to Vermont and look what's here. It's like, oh my goodness, this is a much different kind of landscape. So that was a real fun segue. I did that for almost 3 years up here. Instead, I moved back. It took me a long time to get here, but I moved back here, after being just like backyard homesteaded, fruit growing and fooling around in Pennsylvania. I got back to Vermont in full time in 2004. And of course, permaculture was just launching, and was involved with some of the permaculturists in this area and others, and got excited by the idea conceptually, and started to think, what can I grow in zone 4 that would kind of scratch this itch I have to be involved with productive plants, the idea of productive landscape that, is producing not just for us as humans, but for all my relations here, everywhere we go. There's so many things that have to eat, including us. So, and of course, witnessing the Green Revolution happening during my youth, because I was born in 1957. So the Green Revolution, was really just launching hard. And so corn, soy was just becoming the thing to do. And chemical ag was freaking huge and, growing all the time. So in the light of understanding that ecologically, that the corn deserts that we're planting all over where we had the Great Plains is a freaking nightmare. I'm like, well, what do we do? What's the story about like changing that up? What could that become instead of 200 million or 300 million acres of corn? What would it look like? What else could happen there? And of course, hanging with the permaculturists right away, I'm turned on to the work of Russell Smith, J. Russell Smith. He's probably was reading that book was like, oh my word. Okay, so I'm not the only one that's kind of worried about this. Those of you who haven't seen this book, you open the first page and it's a picture of the world with train cars going around it. A modern freight train long enough to reach around the world 18 times. If the train ran 20 miles an hour continuously, it would take 3 years to pass by your house. The whole thing. That's the legacy of humanity. We're not like trash the millions of years of soil. That is really the single most important thing besides water and air we have on the planet. So what else could we do? And so start looking into all these different various crops. And I got bit so hard by the nut tree bug. I started growing chestnuts. I saw some chestnuts that were growing here in Vermont. And of course, I saw chestnuts in Pennsylvania, but never really paid too much attention. So I was doing apples and some fruit, and then I started growing chestnuts. It was just like a plague. It just bit me so hard. It still has me. So the nut trees have me so hard still. I just cannot help but collect, massive quantities of germplasm as part of my collection. But I think I'm jumping ahead just a little bit anyway. So 2004, made my way up here in Vermont, working as a building contractor, and started growing fruit and nut trees, especially nut trees, and realized maybe about 2010 or 2012, there's no way for me getting away from them. And I started to understand I wanted to have a farm and farm those trees and get out of what I was doing. So I put my target on that, like my sights on that. And I moved to a farm. I was in a very rough and rugged, beautiful mountainous place here in Vermont with no soil. There was no topsoil left. It had all been washed down the hill. Trying to grow there. And then 8 years ago, 2015, I was able to buy this farm, which is now Perfect Circle Farm in Berlin, Vermont, where I am growing and collecting all the plants that I am enamored with. The farm is wet. I'm very wealthy in water. And so sorting out how to deal with that. Also, the farm had been let go. The previous farmer died in 1969, and his wife lived here until she died in 2010. And then their oldest daughter lived here until I purchased the place in 2015. And the farm was let go. It had not been mowed in, 15 or 20 years. It had not been maintained as a farm since 1969. So it was a real great opportunity to put this place back together and kind of make it the way I want as I'm going. So it's been a huge amount of fun. The Perfect Circle Farm, I started selling plants on the internet and started that. And that quickly kind of emerged out to be something that I could see would go a long way in supporting my family and myself. So last year, I went full-time retired to the farm. Of course, I am 66, so it was it was a timely thing to do.
That all sounds like quite the journey. What were your goals with starting Perfect Circle Farm when you purchased the land? Or still, what are your goals for it today?
So the Perfect Circle Farm, kind of my goal as an individual here, is to create a collection of Zone 4 hardy germplasm that will remain once I'm gone. And the reason for that is there isn't one. There's been no Zone 4 person that has studied all the plants that have been discovered since the 1900s by the white people here, and organized them in a repository anywhere in Zone 4. You have a little bit of work in Zone 5, tremendous amount of work in Zone 6. The people that I call the heroes upon whose shoulders I stand, all were working very hard at the turn of the century into up to the 1940s, to create various collections of germplasm that would suit this tree crops, food forest, permaculture, agroforestry, silvopasture mentality that is coming back once again into the forefront. So the whole idea here is, which plants have been or shown by these fantastic collectors and breeders in the past will grow here, meaning that they're hardy enough to survive, and B, set fruit. Two very different criteria, right? So it turns out a tremendous amount of the plants that'll grow in Zone 6, juglans, carria, persimmon, pawpaw, chestnut, hazelnut, hybrid hazelnuts, and all kinds of fruit trees will all grow here quite well. Persimmons, I'm not going to say quite well. They'll grow here. We'll get back to persimmons later on. And so I've been kind of systematically, as best I can, through my visitations to the collections of all the crazy people that have gone before me, bringing back germplasm, both seed and signed wood for grafting, and trying to put together a collection of everything I think we'll be able to produce here. And that's from all the best plants that have been evaluated up to date by everyone I can find, either historically or that's alive today.
That's all really interesting, Buzz, and really important work. When you say people who have come before who worked on the improvement of these tree crops, obviously indigenous peoples selected and improved tree crops in North America for millennia, and we wouldn't have the improved selections of nut trees that we have today if it weren't for them. But I'm thinking that you're referring or also talking about some of the breeding work that was done in the early 20th century. Could we talk about that a bit, if that's the case?
John Hershey is the one who often is, I think of first whenever I talk about this kind of stuff. John Hershey was from right outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He ended up in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, is where he ended up farming. And now Downingtown is about 20 minutes from where I grew up, which is great, right? Of course, I never heard of John Hershey until I was here in Vermont and started reading Russell Smith. I'm like, wait a second, where is this place? No one knew, which is fun, or very few knew, and no one was saying. So John Hershey, he studied first with J.F. Jones. Now, J.F. Jones is a famous tree person. J.F. Jones is actually the person who kind of single-handedly shepherded in the pecans in the far south. He learned how to graft early and taught everyone how to graft and selected, helped select and breed all the great pecans from the deep south. And once that kind of work had kind of been done for him, he got talked into somehow to moving to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and starting a northern tree crops nursery there. So he had a J.F. Jones nursery right outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania. John Hershey was lucky enough to work for J.F. Jones as a young person. J.F. Jones was his mentor, taught him everything he knew. J.F. Jones unfortunately died quite young, and Hershey went on his own to work in Downingtown, PA. Don Hershey's nursery was called America's number one tree crops nursery. And he was incredibly enthusiastic about what he was doing, and was also great friends with J. Russell Smith. For those of you who don't know, Russell Smith was a professor at Swarthmore and Columbia, and had a huge interest, of course, in tree crops. Wrote the seminal book, Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture, first 1927, and then the 1950s version is much more in depth. And so Hershey and Smith had a lot of time together, and Smith encouraged Hershey, and Hershey didn't need much encouragement. And during the course of Hershey's, putting his nursery together and finding his way, he brought a tremendous amount of plants from everywhere to Downingtown, Pennsylvania. In the early 30s, Russell Smith suggested him to FDR to run the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, Tree Crops Nursery, which was part of the New Deal. So Hershey went there for a number of years, organized that nursery, got it all started. They started collecting germplasm from the Tennessee Valley, which was a huge and very advanced population of indigenous people who were also collecting. So they had tremendous trees to pull from. And I'm quite sure Hershey recognized that the trees were being systematically destroyed, that the native people had collected. So there were many collections of, and there still are, remnant collections of the indigenous people's tree crops work that remain. We see them periodically, and we know that they're being collected from by many people. So that's John Hershey. And so John Hershey went back. He only worked 5 or 6 years at the TVA and went back to Downingtown, Pennsylvania, and bought a much larger nursery because he had money for the first time in his life, and started really planting. And of course, he died in 1969, and his property was never conserved or saved. So in 1980, they developed that property, 72-acre farm, with thousands upon thousands of trees, which are half of them are still there. So his nursery rows, which are a mile long, there's about 11 or 12 nursery rows about a mile long, along with many of his orchards that are parts of them remain. Fantastic selection of persimmons, all kinds of pecan, tons of crazy stuff, seed stuff in his orchards, spotted through with grafted hickories, heat cans, pecans, persimmon. There's some pawpaw there, chestnut, mulberry, hazelnut. I mean, he grew everything. Hershey also found the Calhoun and Millwood honey locusts, which have over 30% sugar. he was very excited about by honey locust because Hershey was an agriculturalist. He farmed animals, so a lot of the things he was growing was for his animals. Honey locust was a big deal because 30% sugar. The pods keep all winter long. You throw them in the barn and fork them down to the cows all winter. So he loved honey locust. Unfortunately, honey locust isn't hardy, or the real sweet ones are not hardy in zone 4, which I cry about all the time. So John Hershey, my foremost giant upon whose shoulders I stand. John Gordon. Now, John Gordon was almost contemporary to me. John Gordon died in the teens, 2000 teens, sometime 12 maybe. And he had a 45-acre nursery in outside of Buffalo. And his nursery is also still there. It's probably 90% intact. So you can, well, I can, but most people can. You have to spend a lot of time organizing and negotiating with people that own the places to be able to come there and collect. And they don't want a lot of people, and it's a tenuous proposition at best, collecting from the orchards of people that go before us. But if you ever get to John Gordon, you see just a tremendous experimental plantings of hickory, pecan, persimmon, chestnut, hazelnut, pawpaw, and other plants. He just was there's probably 10,000 pecan seedlings at his farm on 45 acres. It's a jungle you can barely walk through. So it's so much fun to see. So John Gordon has a book called Nut Growing Ontario Style. So anyone who's interested in growing nuts, that is the best reference book I have come in contact with for the work that I'm doing for temperate nut growing Ontario style. And it is out of print. You can find it used, but it's also an ebook. You can go right up online and print it out or look at it. For chestnuts, so the chestnut blight was a pivotal moment. You had Dr. Sandy on here. I'm sure you guys talked a lot about chestnut blight and what happened. Well, the chestnut blight, of course, happened to turn the century 1900-ish, and then quickly wiped out most of the Americans, or they knew it was coming. So the Arthur Graves, among a lot of others, started breeding all the Asian species with the American at that time. And very few people know this, but the collection at Hamden, Connecticut, of the breeding work done by Arthur Graves and then the 3 or 4 people that have come after him is phenomenal. Just absolutely mind-blowing to see. The oldest trees there were planted, handmade crosses, so this tree by that tree, and were planted in the late 20s. And those trees are still there. 2.5, 3 foot diameter trees, 85 feet tall, especially the Chinese by Japanese by American crosses, CJAs, we call them in shorthand. Those plants are just phenomenal. Look very similar to oaks, not quite as tall as the native forest, which is a bummer, but huge trees. Another giant whose shoulders I stand on with chestnuts, Fayette Eder, was in Pennsylvania. His farm is still there as well. And Eder was breeding chestnuts and collecting mostly shellbark hickory, along with some shag, and then pecans. He was also breeding. So Fayette Eders, there's the rows of grafted hickories are 11 feet apart for the walk-in rows or the mowing rows, and the plants are on 4 foot to 5 foot centers. Hundreds of grafted shellbarks. So Eder was a lineman for the electric company. So he was out all the time on the lines with his eyes open looking for trees. And so he did there's quite a few trees that he's found and named. So that's an interesting place to see all those crazy nuts. And collecting scionwood, so grafting is a very interesting thing, because if you go to someone's collection, every grafted tree has a name, but there are no tags. So how do you manage that? You're looking in books, you're trying to match up the nuts, you're trying to figure it out, you're talking to other people who might know. So there's a bunch of other people that have collections like that I also go to observe how the plants look as they grow, get an idea for size and scope and scale, and then to collect the germplasm both as cuttings, scionwood, or as nuts to plant out here on my farm.
Yeah, thank you for the rundown of the history of nut collecting in America. You sort of just touched on a question I was going to ask about your experiences going out and collecting germplasm, whether that's cutting, scion, seed from these various repositories. And my experience is, like you just were saying, sometimes there's not great record keeping, or there was record keeping, and you can't find them. Over the years, have you found anything that works as far as ways to track down old cultivars or improve genetics, or any tips you can provide in terms of ways to do that more efficiently?
Oh, yeah. So we talked about turn of the century 1900, and a lot of the giants in this field were hard at work. Well, they formed something called the Northern Nut Growers Association. That formed in 1910. The first meeting was 1910. They formed the organization. So the first real meeting was 1911. Well, they've had meetings every single year since then, and still do have those meetings. And the next one is, at Ben's alma mater there at the University of Missouri, coming up this July. So I'd encourage anyone who has any interest in nut growing, especially nut growing, pawpaw, and persimmon. The pawpaws and persimmons have somehow got a pass in the nut growing world, to join the Northern Nut Growers Association. One of the very interesting things is every year at the annual meeting, there are any number of presentations, 10, 20, 30, 40 presentations by the giants in the field. And what they've done year after year after year is publish all the presentations in a journal. And so you have, starting in 1910 till last year, you have all this information, which has been scanned and is down into a searchable PDF and available for, I think it's $100, gets you a memory stick with the download of all that information, including, the Nutshell, which is a quarterly publication of the Northern Nut Growers Association. So if you're interested in anyone or anything, you can drill down into these books. When actually it's, this gigantic, 12,000 page PDF or whatever it is, and sort through and gather information about who was doing what, where, when, and how. It is incredibly fantastic, but it is so easy to spend so much time drilling down through this stuff. It's easy to get sidetracked. So Northern Nut Growers Association. The other thing the Northern Nut Growers Association has going for it is the people that are still alive today. There are a lot of people that know way more about nuts and growing than I ever will, who are not on the internet, are not on social media. You cannot reach them. They are offline, and the only place to get a hold of them is to see them once a year at the annual meeting of the Northern Nut Growers Association. This year, the annual meeting of the Northern Nut Growers Association in Missouri is also a combined meeting of the Chestnut Growers Association of America. So it'll be a chestnut meeting, and it's at University of Missouri, where we have HARC, which is the chestnut repository of all these grafted plants. And there's other collections there as well. It's a great collection of black walnut, which is hopefully I'll get a chance to look at, see, because it's been on my radar for a long time. So Northern Nut Growers Association is a huge resource for figuring out historically what was going on. I would say after that, the biggest resource that I've had for doing any of this is online. And I hate to plug Facebook, which I don't really love the platform, but there are so many amazing groups and people who are interested in spreading the information they know about tree crops on Facebook that, if you're interested in chestnuts or hickory and hecan or, persimmon or pawpaw or mulberry or on and on the list goes, you can join these groups, figure out who's who, figure out who knows what they're doing, figure out who has germplasm for sale, seeds and scion cuttings, and you can start to amass your collection of what you want for your spot. So it's that's the next best, greatest way, I think. That's been the best for me, is to find out who's growing what and meet the people who are growing it, because you can meet the people there who are online still. And once you start, it's funny because it's not a huge circle of crazy nut people. And so once you start to meet people, you start to realize that, so-and-so never goes anywhere. So if you want to find out about their collection, you have to go to their farm, their house. Quite frankly, that's the most fun thing I do. Second most fun thing. First most fun thing I do is give tours of this farm. Second most fun thing I do is go on the road and meet these people and hang out with them and hear what they've been doing for the last year or whatever, and find out, what nutty project they have going on, and, where did they get that tree? What? that giant, fantastic tree is only 15 years old. It was a seedling of X, and it's already producing like that, like crazy. Those kind of really exciting things happen when you're out exploring. And it's a totally fun thing. It takes a lot of time and a lot of time to do those explorations.
That does sound fun. And so when you're looking to collect some germplasm of a given species, what are your thoughts in terms of like collecting scion versus collecting seeds? I'm sure it depends on species, whether or not, if you hear about improved genetics, and it depends on the trait too, whether the seedlings will have similar properties to the parents versus going and getting scion wood and grafting and being sure that the tree that you grow will have, the same properties of the parent tree. Are there certain times where you're interested in the seeds of a special cultivar from the past, for example, versus you want to have the actual, scion wood so that you can replicate it?
Yeah, so that's a clear both, right? So I've been around enough of the collections and enough of even the living collectors to know that most nut tree seed, if it's gathered from a clone, a grafted tree, a known cultivar, and it's in an orchard that is where that tree is surrounded by other grafted cultivars, the chances of the seed you're collecting being high quality is way, way higher than wild seed. So I pretty much don't collect any wild seed unless I'm really short on rootstock for that particular plant. I always go cultivar seed. It's expensive, both in terms of time and money when you're collecting and or to buy it. But over and over again from all these people that are still alive, specifically, and from the stuff I see at Hershey's and Gordon and so forth, I know they have the same mindset as me. It's like they're all growing thousands upon thousands of nut tree seed, and so they're searching for the next best cultivar. And if you have both seed plants and grafted plants, once you determine that a seed plant doesn't have the qualities as a infant or an adolescent that you're looking for in the tree, which you don't have to have the fruit on the tree to see that. That's an interesting thing to understand about trees. You can determine that tree doesn't have enough of what you're looking for while it's still young. So that tree grown from seed now becomes the perfect rootstock. You take a cutting, scion wood piece from the tree you want and put it on top work that seedling. And, the top worked tree grows far more quickly than bench grafted stuff. It just the root system is not disturbed. The tree is usually larger. It's much easier to do.
So that's interesting what you said, that early on in the tree's life, there are things you could notice that would make it desirable or undesirable even before it starts to produce a crop. Is that right?
Oh, yes. There's a lot of things. The first one is vigor. You plant a block of, let's say, get 100 chestnut seed from a good orchard, from a mother tree that you love. You plant a block of 100 seed. Well, I'm typically roguing out 50% of those in year one, right? Half of them are going to be the bottom half as far as just general vigor. So I'm not looking for trees that don't have vigor. If you can't outcompete, and I plant them pretty tight in order to get the trees to have, compete and, to suppress weeds and to make a quick canopy and to push each other up. I want them taller. And so you see right away, like, oh, look at that one. It's, it's twice as tall as the average plant there, and like that, half of them are going to don't have that kind of vigor for whatever reason. It might be conditions, but, I'm looking for the ones that really jump. That's the first thing we look for is vigor. And so we rogue those out right away. 50% of them, when we transplant those seedlings the first time, the bottom half for me anyway, are gone. And when I say bottom half, that's a loose approximation. Sometimes it's bottom third, sometimes it's the bottom 70%. With persimmons, it's 99 trees out of 100. Do not get persimmons in Vermont. It's 99 trees out of 100 don't get moved on. I get 1 in 100 for those that I think are vigorous enough and don't burn and that don't get burnt by the frost and the cold. So we rogue out the non-vigorous ones. And then, if you spend a lot of time, you start spending time looking at trees, you understand there's some other things you're looking for. Bud placement, size and distance of the bud from the stem, how far the bud sticks out from the stem, color of the leaf. the size of the leaf, the way the buds are placed on the tree. All these things you can start to look at and say, oh, really, that looks like a really good tree. That thing's really stretching out well, makes very strong growth. Oh, look at that. Every branch has perfect branch angles. And then you dig it, you get to dig the plant. We say, oh, look, root system's phenomenal. So that's how these trees become more important long before they make seed. And that information came to me through John Gordon's book. He's all about that, pre-selecting, and what to look for in seedlings that will be predictive of their relative ability to produce large crops and big nuts and have long-term health. So that's an important thing to understand when you're growing from seed. If you have a lot of seedlings available and you're grafting, you need a lot of seedlings, especially if you're trying to have a farm that sells grafted plants. You need to have a lot of seedlings. So you're definitely not grafting on the best plants you have. So if you rogue out the bottom 50%, the top 10% might get lined out in long-term nursery rows. The next 40% are available for sale to other people and for grafting on. So that's kind of how you figure out your numbers.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense. Another question I had was, at your farm, you grow a lot of different types of hard to find species. And I'm wondering if there are any species you feel like need more attention in the world, the permaculture world or the tree crop world, that people aren't really growing enough of. And that might be all of them. We might need more people to grow, every species. But I'm just sort of wondering what you're interested in now, what you've been looking for, or what you think needs more attention.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think everybody who's kind of involved in permaculture and tree crops understands right now that how hot pawpaws are. Pawpaws are just so hot. Everybody wants them. They cannot get nearly enough pawpaws to satisfy this country's need for grafted cultivar pawpaw. And I would love to see every crop we talk about in that same light, because I really believe in my heart that there's going to come a time not too far from now when we're going to try to replace hundreds of millions of acres of annual crops with perennial crops. I think it's going to happen. And we're going to need to have the germplasm. And a lot of it's there, but it is by no means been completely collected and or proved out. So yeah, I'd like to see that same hot feeling with every tree. Chestnuts are very hot right now too. The chestnut people are a little spooked because we're planting, tens of thousands or more of really good chestnut seedlings out every year all over this country, which is great. I don't think it hasn't reached the pawpaw fervor yet. Persimmons, I think, are the next hot thing. Persimmons, my favorite fruit. And the work of persimmons, the work on getting us to where we are today with persimmons, from the turn of the century, 1890, 1900 to, I guess till not that far back, we were just collecting. We were just siphoning, looking around and finding the best plants from that the indigenous people had left behind for us and giving them names and calling them this, that, and the other. And then the breeding work for the American persimmon is just starting now with the hybridization. Jerry Lehman kicked that off by getting Rosianka and Nikita's Gift going from the work they did with embryo rescue to get those plants going. And in the meantime, David Laverne and Donald Compton and Cliff England and some other people, Matt Constantine, they're breeding hybrids of the American persimmon, which are more prolific, larger fruit, sweeter, more pretty, have better qualities. And so the persimmons, the next, I hope, Savannah Institute has picked up persimmon as a plant of interest for them. So there's a lot of interest in persimmon. So and I'm interested in growing persimmons in Zone 4. So I'm over 35,000 seedlings here that I have already rogued to get to the very few that I have lined out, which is probably only a few hundred at this point. Growing here, we lined out, and I don't know how many of them will shape up. But that's I want that to kind of be my contribution to the persimmon project. Is okay, which ones are hardy, and what are the limitations? What actually limits persimmon growing in Zone 4? Because Zone 5, it's pretty successful. Zone 4 is it's still a pretty hard line. As far as productive plants that produce calories for us to consume as mammals, chestnut has the same profile as corn, very similar food profile. The yield per acre isn't as high, but the offset of the energy inputs is so much lower. We could have way more chestnuts and get a very similar product for eating rather than corn. And acorns are another one. Whole cultures survived on acorns in this country forever and ever before we got here. Then the hard nut trees, the shell juglans and the carya. Walnut has a similar food profile to ground beef. Plants with high oil and huge amount of protein. So the people look at these crops and say, "Oh, but it's so hard to harvest." Well, so was corn back in the day. You could harvest it and grind it in a mortar and pestle or do whatever, but producing the amount of corn we do now, it's taken a monumental effort. We have the tree crops that are, high protein, high carbohydrate. We have not had that at all. That effort has never taken place. And I'm sure we'd have very similar results if we made that effort in the same way we did with the Green Revolution and corn and soy.
An important point that it's not just a bottleneck of genetics right now. There's also bottleneck of infrastructure to do this type of farming on a larger scale. And then potential, I don't know exactly about the demands for these types of crops commercially, but I would imagine that there's a long way we need to go to incorporate some of these lesser known food plants like persimmon or even chestnuts to a large portion of the US, and there's a lot of education that needs to happen and changes in food culture, or even in, like you mentioned, in industry, there's industrial uses too. So do you feel like, are there people or organizations out there that are doing good promotion of these plants for food to make them more accessible to the general public, or to put out good resources on how to use them?
No, I think there's a big effort, on the individual level and on small groups. But I think it's important and fantastic. I think right now we're in an interesting point in the landscape of food. For those of us understand the importance of perennial crops that go for 100 or hundreds of years, that understanding goes back to Smith and before. The people who were here before us, that's what they were doing. They were not big time tillers. There may have been the Three Sisters and some corn growing, but that was not their staple crop. They were living off hickory, right, and chestnuts and black walnut and tree crops. And for sugar, for sweetness, you're here in the forest that went from the coast here, this whole country, all the way to the Great Plains. What was there that's sweet? There was persimmon, there was pawpaw. There was no apple. There's no peaches, no cherry. There was sour cherries, but there was not much sweet. So persimmons would have been a real treat. Same thing with pawpaw. So it's a different way to think about, like, a food forest. Doesn't have the things that are sweet are these kind of crops. We're fortunate now because we do have pears and peaches and apples and cherries and grapes and those kind of things that we can grow along with the other tree crops, which make a more balanced kind of, how do we get our sweet and savory existence here. But the landscape now is, I think now the genetics collection is ahead of the idea of how to process and make it into food. But we're at the risk now, 100 and some years later, of losing a lot of the genetics that the people from the early 1900s realized they had to preserve. And so the preservation took place, and Hershey and John Gordon and Fayette Eder, and the list goes on and on. Little Page, there's tons and tons of repositories of these tree crops at various places, private and public, that these crops I see every time I go to Hershey's. Every time I go to Hershey's nursery, where there are 300 or 400 condos and X many single family homes, a certain percentage of his trees have been removed or destroyed one way or another. And I've only been going there since 2016. 2016 is not a long time that I've been observing, but there are a lot of trees gone that have never been evaluated, that he thought were important, and they were grafted and are gone. And were they something we don't know? Is it a tree that's been lost already? Who knows? So I think we're at the point now where we're at that strange intersection of, the genetics have been preserved. There's not enough interest in taking them to the next stage, which would be the intermediate stage between, okay, here we are, we're exploring, we're finding, we're preserving, we're collecting, we're starting to breed. Now we have to have some mid-level size facilities where we're growing these crops out, and they're getting processed into food that people can eat and say, whoa, I never knew hickory nuts were so amazing. Hey, these black walnuts are really interesting. My goodness, this is a protein. This is like the meat in my dish. I can have this in my veggies instead of beef. So none of that's really taking place on any kind of larger scale. And I don't know what would bring that into being. I think, the as we get further and further down the climate change CO2 problem, atmospheric change we're having with CO2 and other greenhouse gases, so of going to perennial crops will be much more understood and thought about. But I don't see us coming there very soon. We're still fighting about whether electric cars are a good idea. So,
Buzz, could we talk about heartnut for a second? Because I know that that's a tree that you collect from at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. And for me, the interest in heartnut is the harvest window and the availability to harvest them like they'll ripen on the counter. Is that correct? I don't know too much about it.
yes. So heartnut, well, a lot of these nuts will ripen on the counter. Chestnuts will ripen on the counter. You pick the chestnut and the burr. If you're there and you need to have them, you can pick them 2 weeks early in the burr. They'll ripen and fall out wherever you have them. Not that it's fun or easy. Same thing with heartnut. I mean, the best way to harvest any of these plants is when the nuts are ripe. But all the walnuts are the same. You can pick them somewhat green in the husk, bring them back and ripen them at your own at your own convenience. The big benefit for heartnut, for me anyway. So heartnut is those who don't know, a Japanese walnut, which is Juglans allantifolia. And allantifolia means that, it's like an ailanthus. So the leaves are very much like an ailanthus, which is another tree. And it's variety cordiformis, which means heart-shaped. So heart-shaped nut. So Juglans allantifolia, the nut is round, straight species. But the heart nut actually looks exactly like a heart. And what makes it so interesting and fascinating to me is it is a locket. When you crack it along the sutures, that nut comes out whole. And it also has the lovely conditions of being a middle mixture between black walnut and English walnut, Juglans regia, which that's the nut we buy in the supermarket all over this country is English walnuts, Juglans regia. And heartnut tastes more like that nut, like the Juglans regia, than it does like black walnut for sure. So it's got a little richer taste, but also cracks super easy. It's also far hardier. Juglans regia, English walnut, you can crack those. A lot of those you crack them with your fingers to take the nut out, which is kind of amazing. Or you can, and the equipment to husk the hull them is easy, and it's easy for them to do and clean out the nut meats. They come out in halves, much like pecans. And heartnut is the other nut that when you crack it, the nut comes out whole, and the husk comes off that plant when it's ripe, just comes right off like an English walnut. The other very cool thing about heartnut is, of course, it's hardy in zone 4, most of them, many of them. Some of them are borderline. It also hybridizes very easily with butternut. And, butternut is our local, in New England, the local walnut we have in the forest everywhere. It's also right now being systematically destroyed by a blight, a canker, which is killing most of them. And so heartnut, coming from the place where the canker came from, and is highly resistant. So the hybrids between heartnut and butternut are highly resistant to that canker. And walnut in general is the fastest growing of the tree crops. It's just so fast. It's the fastest grower. And especially here on my farm, it's almost like it's been indexed for growing juglans. So I'm growing a lot of heartnut seedlings and a lot of heartnut hybrids with butternut. And of course, I'm grafting all the cultivars I can.
For me, the thing about heartnuts that also is really appealing is just you can harvest them early, but they all hang down on a chain, where you can just with a bucket and clippers, you can harvest like 10 nuts at once. It just seems like in terms of the processing and the harvest, you can get ahead of them. You can get to them ahead of the squirrels, like my grandfather planted some English walnuts and the squirrels get them every single year. In terms of thinking about the whole picture and the harvest, it just seems like heartnuts seem really, really to have a lot of potential.
Heartnut is a great plant. There's no doubt about it. And it looks like a big cluster of grapes hanging on the tree. But it also is very attractive to squirrels who will cut them down green as well once they get the hang for them. That's one of the big problems with nut crops, right? Is that there are many other things that want to eat them besides us. So you have to be aware of that and understand that's a challenge.
Yeah, along those lines, I wanted to ask you about the Hecon, which conceptually would be something I'd really want to try because I love hickory nuts, I love pecans, and at Hark, I was able to collect from quite a few different Hecon trees, different grafted cultivars, but I'd say almost all of them were affected by weevil and had or just were producing nuts that were empty, at least the year that I collected them, and potentially even 2 years in a row. Do you think, have you had good luck or success, or know of other people who had good success growing like reliable crops from Hecon?
From Hecan, yeah, some of the Hecans are reliable producers. Unfortunately, if there's hickory weevil in your area, just like chestnut weevil, it is a big deal. You will have to manage for it either holistically or chemically, or it will destroy your crop. Those critters are hungry too, and they hang around. Dr. Sandy has a great paper on her website about controlling chestnut weevil with chickens. I have yet to try it, but I will get a chance because we keep about 400 layers here. So I'm going to get a chance to run my birds through my chestnuts as they get more sizable. Actually, up until 2 days ago, they were having a great time out in the chestnut orchard, picking the heck out of everything that was underneath those trees. I don't have weevil here yet, but a lot of the country does. Pest and predation is a real concern on all crops, annual or perennial.
We'll just add that to the list of things to improve for these varieties, or maybe even just to improve as far as our management techniques. There's a lot of research that needs to be done, I think.
Yeah, well, same thing. I mean, corn is loaded with pests, right?
Right.
I like to use corn as the example. They spray the shit out of that stuff. It'd be full of a husk maggot or whatever they call that worm that gets in corn. I mean, if they weren't spraying it, they'd be loaded. And same thing. They have to do all the weed control for the ground every year, cultivate the ground every year. I guess there's no-till, but then they're spraying Roundup. So any crop has management issues that need to be dealt with that can be solved, or at least figured out to a certain degree. Maybe not solved, but figured out so they're viable if we apply ourselves to the problem. But if we're not going to apply ourselves, it's just like, oh, they get weevil, we can't grow them. Well, that's may not be an option. And weevil is very different year to year. I collected in Connecticut this year. There's almost no weevil, and usually it's loaded. So what happened? I have no idea. There's no one studying that, so we don't know what it was, right?
Maybe more turkeys in the area.
Well, that, or is it climate? Is it too hot? Is it too dry? Was it too wet? Is there another pest we don't know about that runs in cycles as well that eats the pupae as they pupate over it in the winter in the soil? There's been no studies on any of this stuff. No one's spent any time really looking at any of the pests real in detail on any of the tree crops from a pest control point of view.
So, Buzz, the first time I ever heard about your farm, I was at a farmer's market in Stowe, Vermont, where some folks were selling sea berry everything. It was like sea berry tincture or like soaps and stuff. And I said, where did you get this amount? Like, where are you sourcing this amount of sea berry to make any sort of product? And they were like, oh, Buzz Ferver, Perfect Circle Farm. So I would like to take a moment to step over and maybe talk about sea berries a little bit. It seems like you're maybe potentially the biggest grower in the Northeast. So let's talk about it.
Well, I'm probably one of the few. The reason I'm the biggest is I'm the few of anyone to grow, any sea berry of any consequence in the Northeast that I know of, anyway. So I have 185 plants in bearing right now, and they're all about anywhere from 6 to 8 years old. Those that are in full bear. I have another 150 probably coming online in the next year or two. So sea berry is a great crop in that it's zone 2 hardy. I've been observing sea berries for almost more than 15 years now. They sucker. They are a suckering bush, so they will colonize. They are very, very strong growers, so they want to colonize. They want to take over space. The spread of the plants is easy to control with mowing or cultivation. The single greatest thing about sea berry for me as a grower is it is a nitrogen-fixing plant. It is very quick to. If the cuttings in 3 or 4 months have nitrogen fixing nodules on the root systems of the cuttings once they're made. And so you can take a cutting, so I can plant it next year. And in, 5 years, it's in full production. Contrary to the general reputation of seaberry, of it liking drought or liking it dry, it'll tolerate dry. It will not grow. Seaberry will just hang out at 3 feet tall for 10 years in sand. Seaberry likes rich soil and access to water. So for all you permacultures out there, if you plant it on next to a running brook, like on a berm or just at the edge of the brook, they just launch and take off. They really, really grow well in that condition. They love the roots to be able to be down in the access to the water. And here at this farm, I have 2 spots where I have water running pretty much 24/7, 365. And the seaberry suckers don't go to the running water and come up on the other side, which is nice. So it seems that the running water is a natural limitation to them suckering. And then on the other side, which is the cultivated side, which I have other crops growing, either mowing and or cultivating to keep the suckers at bay. But they definitely improve the soil from a nitrogen point of view, because my whole farm is very low nitrogen. And anything I'm growing next to the seaberry rows really starts to grow a year or two after you get them in there. So seaberry, if you don't know the plant, seaberry, sea buckthorn, it's Hippophae rhamnoides, which roughly translates into shining horse. So the Mongolian warlords supposedly fed seaberry foliage to their horses to keep them healthy and looking good. The plant is loaded with vitamin C. The berry, I think it has the highest vitamin C of anything we're growing here as far as vitamin C. It's got all kinds of beneficial oils. It's got a high oil content in the berry. The berries have unique quality that they do not abscise, meaning that you can't pick them very readily because they never become loose. When you go to pick them, you smash them. You have to be really careful. It takes forever. So what we've settled on here is we actually cut the branches, berry and all, and freeze them. And once the berries are frozen, you take a branch in your hand and whack it against some kind of anything, like a clean trash can, and the berries all fall off. And if you are prompt, the berries freeze and fall off. As soon as they're frozen hard, they'll come off. And it takes about 2 days before the leaves get so damaged from freezing that they fall off with the berry. So the leaves basically stay on the branch when you whack them. We still need to winnow them through a fan to get rid of a little bit of leaves. Well, last year we did about 2,500 pounds of berries here. And it took us about a month, I think. 3 or 4 of us on it, because the freezing takes time for the berry. And they pretty much all went to, I have a few people that come every year for berries then most of it went to one person here who's processing all kinds of seaberry oxymel for her internet business, which she sells all over the place as well. It's also the one really interesting thing about propagating seaberries. Of course, there's lots of cultivars. I've tried them all here. I've selected the ones that grow the best for me, the way I want to manage their growth and the way they look and how they yield. When it's time to harvest the berries, it's also the exact same time to harvest the summer cuttings. So as we're cutting the branches and taking the berries to the freezer, at that time we cut off all the cuttings we want, because we do a couple thousand seaberry cuttings a year here, and we get we just have access to the most vigorous, lovely cuttings there are. So that just happens to be serendipity, which I never thought didn't see that coming. That was wonderful to find out. Seaberry is delicious. If you've never had it, try to seek it out. It's kind of like orange juicy with some papaya, maybe a little mango thrown in there. It's just a very different flavor. It's very, very sharp, very tart. So it needs to be sweetened. Of course, here in Vermont, we use maple syrup. But I pretty much drink seaberry oxymel, and an oxymel is vinegar, berry juice, and sweetener usually. And then so I have seaberry oxymel I mix with currant juice. I pretty much have that every single day, all year long, which is kind of like my go-to, wintertime tonic to keep myself juiced up with all the vitamins and minerals I need from the farm.
I'm sure it probably keeps you healthy. And how many male plants would you say someone needs to grow? What's the ratio of a male to female?
Yeah. So the literature says, 1 male for every 6 to 8 females. So I kind of have done that. But there are some sections where I didn't put any males for like 20 plants. And I don't see any problem I think they're very prolific. And of course, they are the pollen is airborne. So if you have rows of seaberry and you set it up so that your prevailings are going from row to row to row. So if your prevailings are from the west, then you plant north. You plant perpendicular to the prevailings. They're going to carry the pollen, and they do. I have fantastic pollination over the whole place, even where I've left out males for 20 or more females. So take that as you may.
Great, thank you.
Buzz, I'm wondering if you have any advice for folks who will listen to this podcast episode, and I mean, at least for me, like it gets my blood going. I'm like, I want to buy some land and start my own germplasm. Uh, so for folks who want to do some of the things we've talked about to preserve tree crop genetics, and to the most important thing to do that is to acquire some land. Do you have any advice for folks who are looking to do that? Maybe have you had any experience with access through community land trusts or farm preservation land trusts or other forms of outside funding, or just any sort of tips for people to get started?
Getting a farm in United States of America is a really hard thing. Getting land. You don't need a farm. You need to have some land. You can grow, for my pretty much my whole 40 some years in Pennsylvania, I only had, an acre or a little more, maybe two, multiple houses, but it wasn't a lot. But I had hundreds upon hundreds of plants for my own use. So you can have an amazing collection on a small amount of land. You just have to hack the plants and espalier them and prune them tight and do all those kind of things you do to keep plants healthy. When it's fun too to be doing all that stuff. I mean, espalier and that kind of pruning is, if you have a small amount of land, it is so much fun and quite rewarding. I tell everybody I worked as hard as I could for 42 years to get a farm, and I'm happy to be here. And I'm retired at 65 years old. I retired to the farm, and it's backwards. People that have the interest, the talent, and the ability to manage a farm and produce crops of any kind, should certainly be encouraged in ways that is not happening now. I'm happy to see that the USDA is adding, some of the agroforestry and silvopasture techniques, to their things that they will fund. I'm starting to explore that a little bit. We have Megan Giroux up here at Interlace that's been doing a lot of work here trying to get it going, and it's starting to take off. There's funding available, and the people are working on it. So I'm very encouraged by that. In Pennsylvania, they're working on productive riparian buffers, not just riparian buffers, but productive buffers. So the buffer becomes another source of income for the farm, because almost every farm, so many farms in the Northeast and the East in general are on a brook, a creek, or a river. So riparian buffers are important for water quality, but how do you make them productive, and how do we get accepted? So it's only native plants. Well, maybe they'll allow some other plants, whatever. That's also in its infancy. But if you're interested in growing plants, wherever you are, you should be doing it on your patio, on your 14th floor, condo, whatever. Just play with them. It's just something you'll find out if you have that interest. It will come out of you. The plants will bite you. They'll just latch onto you, and you'll want to do more. And if you're really interested in doing it as a farmer, you just have to pull out all the stops. There's some farmers that are getting some stuff for me this spring. There's 4 of them that have formed a cooperative. It's all legal, all this stuff. And they've been renting land for years now, right? And working as this collaborative. And they're buying a farm right now as we speak. He was here visiting one of the guys from the farm. There's, it's 4 of them. And he spent half the time walking around with me answering the phone because the bank had a million questions. The realtors have questions. And because it's weird to be buying a farm as a collective. So you're going to have to think outside the box and really stretch out, beg, borrow, and steal, and just do whatever it takes to get land in this climate we're in right now, which is a shame.
Yeah, I can agree with you there. That's about it in terms of the questions that I had. I think we put together a fantastic, this was amazing, Buzz. Thank you so much. It's a fantastic episode. Ben, what about you? Do you have any last questions?
No, I agree. We covered a lot. Thank you, Buzz, for coming on and giving us some of your history and the history of this work. It's really important, and I hope it inspired a lot of people to get interested.
Yeah. And as always, if you go to my website, perfectcircle.farm, you can contact me. Anyone who's listening, encourage you to give advice, talk about plants. I love doing that. Sometimes there's some lag time. It's like now's a great time to get a hold of me. Springtime, forget it. You're going to wait. It's insane.
Well, maybe I'll see you in July at the NNGA conference.
Oh, you'll definitely see me. I'll definitely be there. Yeah. And thanks
forward
for
to
having
that.
me on. I really appreciate it. And keep up the good work.
Thank you. You as well. Take care, buds.
Bye for now.